The concept of linguistic relativity concerns the relationship between language and thought, specifically whether language influences thought and, if so, how. This question has led to research in multiple disciplines, especially anthropology, cognitive science, linguistics, and philosophy. Among the most popular and controversial theories in this area of scholarly work is the theory of linguistic relativity, an often-cited, strong version of the claim, first given by Lenneberg in 1953, proposes that language structure determines how we perceive the world. A weaker version of this claim posits that language structure influences the worldview of speakers of a given language but does not determine it. There are two formal sides to the color debate, the Universalist and the Relativist. The Universalist side claims that the biology of all human beings is all the same, so the development of color terminology has absolute universal constraints. The relativist side claims that the variability of color terms cross-linguistically points to more culture-specific phenomena. Because color exhibits both biological and linguistic aspects, it has become a deeply studied domain that addresses the relationship between language and thought. The color debate was made popular in large part due to Brent Berlin and Paul Kay's famous 1969 study and the subsequent publishing of basic color terms, the universality and evolution. Although much on color terminology has been done since Berlin and Kay's famous study, other research predates it, including the mid-19th century work of William Ewart Gladstone and Lazarus Geiger, which also predates the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, as well as the work of Eric Lenneberg and Roger Brown in 1950s and 1960s. Universalist view, Berlin and Kay. The Universalist theory that color cognition is an innate, physiological process rather than a cultural one was introduced in 1969 by Brent Berlin and Paul Kay in the study detailed in the book Basic Color Terms, The Universality and Evolution. The study was intended to challenge the formerly prevailing theory of linguistic relativity set forth by chief linguistic figures Edward Sapir and Benjamin Lee Whorf in the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Berlin and Kay found universal restrictions on the number of basic color terms that a language can have, and on the ways the language can use these terms. The study included data collected from speakers of 20 different languages from a number of different language families. Berlin and Kay identified 11 possible basic color categories: white, black, red, green, yellow, blue, brown, purple, pink, orange, and gray. To be considered a basic color category, the term for the color in each language had to meet certain criteria. It is monomorphemic. It is monolexemic. Its signification is not included in that of any other color term. Its application must not be restricted to a narrow class of objects. It must be psychologically salient for informants. In case of doubt, the following subsidiary criteria were implemented. The doubtful form should have the same distributional potential as the previously established basic color terms. Color terms that are also the name of an object characteristically having that color as suspect. For example, gold, silver and ash. Recent foreign loanwords may be suspect. In cases where lexemic status is difficult to assess, morphological complexity is given some weight as a secondary criterion. Berlin and Kay also found that, in languages with fewer than the maximum 11 color categories, the colors followed specific evolutionary pattern. This pattern is as follows: all languages contain terms for black and white. If a language contains 3 terms, then it contains a term for red. If a language contains 4 terms, then it contains a term for either green or yellow. If a language contains 5 terms, then it contains terms for both green and yellow. If a language contains 6 terms, then it contains a term for blue. If a language contains 7 terms, then it contains a term for brown. If a language contains 8 or more terms, then it contains terms for purple, pink, orange, and/or gray. In addition to following this evolutionary pattern absolutely, each of the languages studied also selected virtually identical focal hues for each color category present. For example, the term for red in each of the languages corresponded to roughly the same shade in the Munsell color system. Consequently, they posited that the cognition, or perception, of each color category is also universal. Additional universalist arguments. A later study supporting this universal physiological theory was done by Kesson, Bornstein, and Weisskopf. In this study, 16 4-month-old infants were presented with lights of different frequencies corresponding to different colors. The lengths of habituation were measured and found to be longer when the infant was presented with successive hues surrounding a certain focal color than with successive focal colors. This pattern of response is what is expected when the infants are distinguishing between the focal colors, but not distinguishing between successive hues. This is to say that infants respond to different hues of color in much the same way as adults do, demonstrating the presence of color vision at an age younger than previously expected. Kesson, Bornstein, and Weisskopf therefore claim that the ability to perceive the same distinct focal colors is present even in small children. Research before Berlin and K. Gladstone and Geiger in the paper Language and Thought. Which Side Are You On Anyway? Regia et al. Discuss the presence of a universalist perspective on the color debate in the mid-19th century. In the mid-19th century, various scholars, notably William Gladstone and Lazarus Geiger, noted that the speakers of ancient written languages did not name colors as precisely and consistently as they saw it as the speakers of modern European languages. They proposed a universal evolutionary sequence in which color vocabulary evolves in tandem with an assumed biological evolution of the color sense. Gladstone was a Homeric scholar, and in his writings, notably studies on Homer and the Homeric age, expressed that, because there was virtually a lack of color terminology in Homeric Greek literature, Greeks could probably not see color as we can today. That the organ of color and its impressions were but partially developed among the Greeks of the heroic age. Geiger expanded on Gladstone's ideas by looking at other classic works and hypothesized that man gradually became aware of color over time. He posited the idea that this awareness was connected to the order colors came up in the spectrum, starting with longest wavelengths. Lenneberg and Roberts. Lenneberg and Roberts presented the paper The Denotator of Color Terms at the Linguistic Society of America in 1953. In this paper they reported the findings on color recall in Zuni speakers. Zuni has one color term for yellow and orange, and Lenneberg and Roberts' study reported that Zuni speakers encountered greater difficulty in color recall for these colors than English speakers, who have available terms to distinguish them. Brown and Lenneberg attributed this effect to the property of codability. Linguistic codability is the ease with which people can name things and the effects of naming on cognition and behavior. Brown and Lenneberg. Brown and Lenneberg published a study in Language and Cognition in 1954, where they discussed the effect of codability on recognition. In their experiment they used a series of Munsell chips to test color recall and recognition in English speakers. The findings suggested that the availability of a basic color term in a given language affected the retention of that color in recall testing. Brown and Lenneberg linked the study to Lenneberg and Roberts' 1953 findings on color recall in Zuni speakers. Relativist view. Initially, Berlin and Kay's theory received little direct criticism, but in the decades since the 1969 book, a significant scholarly debate has developed surrounding the universalism of color terminology. Many relativists find significant issues with this universalism. Barbara Saunders and John A. Lucy are two scholars who are prominent advocates of the opposing relativist position. Barbara Saunders believes that Berlin and Kay's theory of basic color terminology contains several unspoken assumptions and significant flaws in research methodology. Included in these assumptions is an ethnocentric bias based on traditions of Western scientific and philosophical thought. She regards the evolutionary component of Berlin and Kay's theory as an endorsement of the idea of progress, and references Smart's belief that it is a Eurocentric narrative that filters everything through the West and its values and exemplifies a universal evolutionary process of modernization. With regard to Berlin and Kay's research, Saunders criticizes the translation methods used for the color terms they gathered from the 78 languages they had not studied directly. Like many others, she also questions the effectiveness of using the Munsell color system in the elicitation of color terminology and identification of focal hues. She feels that use of this chart exemplifies one of the mistakes commonly made by the social sciences, that of taking data sets as defining a phenomenon which supposedly represents the real world, and entails taking a picture of the world for the world and then claiming that that picture is the concept. Finally, she takes issue with the anomalous cases of color term use that she believes Berlin, Kay and Merrifield disregarded in the work on the World Color Survey for the purpose of purifying the results. In Saunders' 1997 article with Van Brakel, they criticize the amount of weight given to the study of physiological color perception as support for the universalism of color terminology. They primarily criticize the idea that there is an autonomous neurophysiological color pathway, citing a lack of concrete evidence for its existence. Saunders is also bothered by the overall contextualization of color terminology and the failure of universalists to address the limitations of the methodologies. She points out that ordinary color talk is used in a variety of ways for flat-colored surfaces, surfaces of natural objects, patches of paintings, transparent objects, shining objects, the sky, flames, illumination, vapors, volumes, films and so on, all of which interact with overall situation, illumination, edges, textures, patternings and distances, making the concept of sameness of color inherently indeterminate. John A. Lucy's criticisms of Berlin and Kay's theory are similar to those of Saunders and other relativists, primarily focusing on shortcomings in research methodologies and the assumptions that underlie them. Lucy believes that there are problems with how linguistic analysis has been used to characterize the meanings of color terms across languages. Referential range and grammatical distribution are two dimensions Lucy believes are critical to defining the meaning of a term, both of which are routinely ignored in research on color terms, which focuses primarily on denotational overlap across languages without any consideration of the typical use of the terms of the formal status. Quote, he also feels that any attempt to contrast color term systems requires understanding of each individual language and the systems it uses to structure reference. Lucy also believes that there is significant bias present in the design of Berlin and Kay's research, due to their English-speaking and Western points of view. He thinks the use of the Munsell color system demonstrates their adherence to the ideas that speech is about labeling accuracy, and that meaning is really about accurate denotation, which he believes both derive directly from the folk understandings of English speakers about how their language works. Quote, He refers to Conklin's study of Hananu as a demonstration of what a study might reveal about a language's color term system when such bias is not present. He demonstrates that an adequate knowledge of the system would never have been produced by restricting the stimuli to color chips and the task of labeling. In summation, he feels that the approach universalists have taken in researching color term universal sets up a procedure that guarantees both the discovery and the form, and that it does not really even matter whether the researchers involved are open-minded and consciously willing to recognize relativism as a possible outcome, because the universalist conclusion is guaranteed by the methodological assumptions. Recent scholarship on color vision has proceeded in three principal domains within the last 20 years. There have been revisions to the Berlin and AMP-K hypothesis. In response, there have been continued challenges to that hypothesis, and lastly, the field of vision science has expanded to explore hue categorization at a perceptual level independent of language-based distinctions, possibly offering compromise in the two polar theories. Revisions of the Berlin and AMP-K hypothesis. In 1999, Paul K. and Louisa Maffei published an article entitled Color Appearance and the Emergence and Evolution of Basic Color Lexicons, in which they outline a series of revisions in response to data collected in the World Color Survey and to Stephen Levinson and his work on the language Yaqtlidny in Papua New Guinea. While upholding an evolutionary track for the addition of basic color terms to any given lexicon, they outlined a series of three partition rules. Black and white, distinguish black and white. Warm and cool, distinguish the warm primaries from the cool primaries. Red, distinguish red. The ordering of these rules is reflective of the data of the overwhelming majority of languages studied in the WCS. However, exceptions do exist, as was accounted for by Yaqtlidny and other languages within the WCS. Furthermore, they also propose a zero rule, one which simply states, partition. Such a rule is necessarily to motivate the specification of later basic color terms, namely those that can no longer be brought about by application of rules 1-3. With respect to the evolution of color terms within a given lexicon, K and Maffei further outlined the possibilities of different trajectories of evolution, though all of those numerically possible are not attested in the World Color Survey. Another significant contribution of this article is a discussion of the emergence hypothesis, its relation to Yaqtlidny and its motivation for the author's revision of evolutionary trajectories. Opposition to Berlin and AMP-K al. Here are three approaches to such critiques, those brought about by implications within the taxonomic structure of the B and AMP-K model, those as seen in research in color perception in children and infants, those brought about by specific fieldwork. Anna Wiertzspicker and Universals of Visual Semantics in an article titled The Semantics of Color, A New Paradigm. Wiertzspicker discusses three main critiques of the universalist approach: the inability to prove the existence of true color terms in languages that lack a superordinate word for color in the taxonomies, the lack of inquiry into the semantic range of any given language's assumed color naming, that the Western Universalist tradition on other languages and cultures one's own conceptual grid and does not reflect the native's point of view, citing Malinowski in the latter. With regard to one, she states that the basic point is that, in many languages, one cannot ask the question, what color is it? The assumption oscillates between two versions. On the one hand, she argues that languages with no superordinate word for color simply do not have minimal color terms. On the other hand, she argues that even if one contests the first point, the fact that one cannot ask the question she posits means that color is not a salient semantic domain in these languages. In the structure of her natural semantic metalanguage, color does not constitute a semantic primitive, though she argues for many others cross-linguistically. Pitchford and Amp-Mullen, the developmental acquisition of basic color terms. This study compares the evolutionary model of color terms of Berlin and Amp-K to the acquisition of color terms in children. The study proceeds to three main questions: are color terms acquired late? Are basic color terms acquired in a fixed developmental order? What factors may influence the acquisition of basic color terms? With regard to 1, they find that color terms are not acquired any later than other relevant lexemes to distinguish objects. It had been thought, for example, that since color is not necessarily unique to a given object, and diverse objects are more likely to share common color than a common shape, that color terms lagged behind shape terms in development. This was found not to be the case. Second, they found no correlation between the order of color term acquisition in children and in languages generally. It was found that gray and brown are learned later in development. There was no preference for the 6 primary color terms over the remaining 3 secondary ones. The similarity between the acquisition of these terms in children and in language vocabularies was assumed to be comparable, since even in current notions of the B and Amp-K hypothesis, the evolutionary order of color terms is thought to be based on universals of neurophysiology. While some studies in neurophysiology have shown greater salience for the basic color terms, neurophysiology has not been able to account for such phenomena as intuitive separations of warm and cool colors. Levinson and Amp-Y acute LID and YE. The Yell language is a language isolate spoken on Rossel Island in Papua New Guinea. Among observations about the clasp derivation, usage of and disagreement over color naming words in Yell is a critique of the BCT model's assumption that languages which have not yet fully lexicalized the semantic space of color with the use of all 11 basic color names decide by use of the fewer composite terms that they do possess. As Stephen Levinson argues, using methodology similar to that used by B and Amp-K for their initial tests and later for the WCS, there are simply regions of the color spectrum for which Yell has no name, and which are not subsumed by larger composite categories, even despite the inventive nature of color terms in Yell that fall outside the criteria for basic status. Given the fact that such color naming words are extremely inventive, Levinson argues that this is highly detrimental to the BCT theory, insomuch that Yell is a language where a semantic field of color has not yet gelled, and thus one not open to universal constraint. As Levinson points out, there is evidence that supports the emergence of BCTs through physical objects and words used to signify simultaneous properties such as lightness. As such, these terms do not cohere as a unique, separable semantic domain denoting hue. Over time, though, and through processes of semantic change, such a domain can emerge. In response to work by Levinson and Lyons, K dubs this perspective the emergence hypothesis. K and Amp-Maffei incorporate the A into their evolutionary track by removing from the model the assumption that languages begin by fully segmenting the color spectrum. This inverts the partition principles, namely by placing 1 and 3 over 0 and 2. That is, languages partially segment the space into black, white, and red and AMP3, and then the assignment to partition and split warm and cool colors accommodates the rest of the space. As K and AMP-Maffei explain, this is essential to explications of why boot terms, which were previously incompatible with the model. However, this model also introduces the possibility for previously divergent evolutionary paths for color terms, since it is only after the rearrangement and reassignment of the partition principles that a language that derived from A origins joins with a language that originally partitioned the whole of the color spectrum. Vision Science and Theoretical Compatibility. Mark Bornstein's essay Hue Categorization and Color Naming. Physics to Sensation to Perception separates an analytical review of vision science and color naming into 3 sections: categorization, and its aids to both perceptual and cognitive functions generally. Color vision and hue categorization. Color naming. As a result, he summarizes both the findings of vision science and the linking of 3 separate but causally related processes within the study of color naming phenomena. He states that the physics of color, the psychophysics of color discrimination, and the psychology of color naming are not isomorphic. The color spectrum clearly exists at a physical level of wavelengths. Humans cross-linguistically tend to react most saliently to the primary color terms as well as select similar exemplars of these primary color terms. And lastly comes the process of linguistic color naming, which adheres both to universal patterns but demonstrates individual uniqueness. While one may have origins in its predecessor, variation among test subjects in vision science and linguistic variation demonstrate that it is not a process of whole causality. In his companion essay, he demonstrates that this process of causality may indeed be reversed, which he explains through a set of models of development: undeveloped, partially developed, fully developed. In response, there are 3 ways that outside experience may affect this development: through induction, modification, or deprivation. Thus the logical possibilities are 1a and AMP1c, 2a, 2b and AMP2c, and 3b and AMP3c. Using this format, he explains that developmental altering in hue categories entail perceptual sharpening and broadening. He attributes this to either maturation or experience. Such a conclusion is necessarily indeterminate because understanding of why certain hue categories are lost and others induced requires further, exacting research. Coming from these 2 perspectives, this leads Bornstein to conclude that there appear to be non-trivial biological constraints on color categorization. The available evidence seems compatible with a position of moderate universality that leads to expectations of probabilistic rather than deterministic cross-cultural correspondence, and that, in color, relativism appears to overlay a universalist foundation.